Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's live webcast, Data Risk in the Third-Party Ecosystem. I would like to introduce today's featured speakers. First, we have Larry Ponemon, Chairman and Founder of Ponemon Institute. Dr. Larry Ponemon is the Chairman and Founder of Ponemon Institute, a research think tank dedicated to advancing privacy, data protection, and information security practices. Dr. Ponemon is considered a pioneer in privacy auditing and responsible information management framework. Security Magazine named him one of the most influential people for security. And from Opus today, we have Lee Kirschbaum, Senior Vice President, Product Marketing and Alliances. Lee is responsible for leading Opus product strategy and marketing, alliances, and global marketing, including branding, corporate communications, customer programs, and events. Before joining Opus, Lee was president of the compliance division at Kroll and a leading provider of investigations, compliance, due diligence, cybersecurity, and e-discovery solutions. So with that, I'd like to get started by turning things over to Lee to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Sharon, for the welcome, and thanks to all of you who are able to join today. And most importantly, thank you, Larry, for allowing us to sponsor and participate in the second annual study of data risk in the third-party ecosystem, and for your active participation in today's webinar. We're honored to present today with Ponemon, one of the most well-known and regarded independent research firms on data protection and information security policy. So as Sharon mentioned, I lead product marketing and alliances at Opus. We're a leading provider of compliance and risk management solutions, and we are founded on the simple premise that faster, better decisions in compliance and risk management can give businesses an extraordinary advantage in the marketplace. Here at Opus, we spend every day thinking about how we can help companies free their business from the complexity and uncertainty of managing third-party risks. So what bigger third-party risk than cyber risk, which really has never been a hotter topic. So if you look at the news on any given day, including today, chances are you'll hear or see of a pretty significant breach. And no business is safe. Even a single incident can be significant. The Ponemon Institute estimated the cost of a breach at over $3 million globally, $3 million US dollars globally, and $7 million for those of you in the US. And that doesn't include brand, reputational, regulatory impacts. So it continues to be one of the biggest risks is third parties who really have extensive access to companies' information. Often it's underestimated, and we'll talk a lot about that today. So during today's presentation, as well as the report, we look forward to not only sharing with you statistics we found around increasing risks, but also perhaps more importantly, what we found in the study that can help you reduce those risks. With that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Larry Ponemon.
Thank you very much, Lee. I appreciate the kind words that you said, and it's absolutely a pleasure to co-present with you today. And to the audience, as you probably know, I'm a research guy. I sometimes refer to myself as a research wonk, and so I'll actually provide kind of each of the key findings of the study. But Lee, from time to time, you're going to chime in because you are far more interesting than I am. So, and it will make for a much better webinar. Really, the purpose of our study is to understand trends in the challenges that companies face in protecting their sensitive and confidential information that is shared with a third party. So we know what third parties are, but sometimes we'll use the term nth party, and an nth party would be if you have a vendor or a contractor, for example, it would be a subcontractor of the contractor may actually end up holding a lot of your information, and you wouldn't even know about it because you don't know all the nth parties that may be involved. Now, what we find in the study is that the risk of sharing sensitive and confidential information with third parties is steadily increasing over the last 2 years. And there are governance and IT challenges and practices that can be implemented to significantly reduce the likelihood of a third party or nth party data breach. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Let's go to our next slide, please. Again, as a researcher, I have to present this to you. It's probably not the most interesting finding, but if you do research, it's very important. So our final sample in our 2017 study is 625 respondents, and the characteristics of our respondents are going to be disclosed later. We talk about our methods, so that's going to be at the end of the presentation. And last year when we did the study, we had about 598. The response rate of 4.1%, if you're a researcher again, you'll know that when you do studies of experts, like the audience that we have here today, basically a response rate of anything greater than 3% is considered remarkable. So we did very, very well in our sampling. Let's go to our next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these bullets because actually when we present the results with you, we'll be covering all of these 5 items. But what we found is that data breach caused by third parties is on the rise. The effectiveness of third-party governance programs unfortunately remains low, and there really hasn't been huge changes from last year. Accountability and board-level involvement has increased a little bit, slightly. Companies lack visibility into third-party and nth-party relationships, and today's programs are insufficient to manage third-party risk. So these are some of the key findings of our study today. Let's go to our next slide, please. Yeah, so, Leah, if you don't mind, do you want to talk a little bit about these best practices?
Yeah, so thank you very much. What I found really valuable in this study was not only sort of asking the questions about the risks, but really kind of correlating it and tying it to what key factors or best practices were identified in a study that helped companies lower the likelihood of a breach. So later on in the presentation, we'll walk through the statistics around this, but essentially what we did was we would map best practices or key drivers to the likelihood of a breach and found 8 significant drivers that would help reduce the likelihood of a breach. So anywhere from somewhere around 5 to 10% changes in the likelihood of a breach just by putting in place these 8 best practices. So depending on the webinar, some of these best practices may seem obvious. So you might say to yourself, of course I should be inventorying all the third parties with whom I share information with. The challenges are really that, when you think about the reality of today's world and the decentralization often of onboarding and managing these third parties, it's often quite difficult. So as we go through the statistics, you'll find that many of the companies surveyed actually do not have in place all of these 8 best practices, and just a handful of these have the potential for very significant reduction in risk.
Thank you. Okay, next slide. We're going to now change gears, and our first topic area is data breaches and the associated third-party data risk. Next slide. Okay, so here's our first data point. So let's kind of have a drum roll. Has your organization experienced a data breach or cyber attack caused by a third party? And what we're presenting is the yes response. And if you kind of look first at the left side bar chart, data breach caused by a third party is now 56% yes, 49% back in 2016. And then if we kind of look at the right side, third-party data risks have resulted in misuse of company information, 42% this year versus 34%. The margin of error, the grand margin of error of the research, this research is approximately 4.8%. We did the math yesterday. We basically say that 5% swing is statistically significant at the 95% level of confidence. And in both cases, it is increase rather than decrease, which is kind of a bad fact. Lee, any comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think of can you explain to those on the webinar the difference between the right chart and the left?
Sure. So the left side, we're looking at a traditional data breach, which could occur because of bad guys, hackers, and so forth, but it's also happened because of human error or even system glitches. In fact, in our studies on data breach, we find that more than half of all data breaches happen not because of bad guys doing bad things, but good people doing stupid things. On the right side, we're looking at third-party data breach, computer cyber exploits, for example, that resulted in the misuse of company information. So it's a different characteristic of kind of a different type of event.
And then the growth year over year seems pretty significant. What do you think is the biggest driver? Is it that there's more breaches occurring, or they're just being detected and identified more now?
Great question, and there's a little bit of conjecture. Even though we do so many studies on data breach, I think in part companies are just better at detecting. So, for example, at 49%, instead of saying, wow, we had 49%, the real number might be 70%, but you just don't know all the data breaches that could happen in an organization. So that's one possibility. We're getting better. On the other side of it, and it doesn't, these are not competing, they can be both, but the other possibility is that there are just more data breaches. And we see that every day, as you mentioned, you read the newspaper or listen to CNN or whatever, there's an event, a cyber exploit or a data breach of significant consequence almost on a daily basis. It's very depressing.
Yeah.
Okay, let's kind of move to our next slide, please. So cybersecurity incidents, as I mentioned, are increasing and difficult to manage. And what we're looking at, and we present the data and collect the data using what's called an objective scale. So you'll see a lot of our results. We use a strongly agree to strongly disagree. And we present the agreement side. So the percentages you see would be strongly agree and agree combined. And so let's look at the three different choices, starting from the left. Cybersecurity incidents involving third parties is increasing from 73% in 2016 to 75%, so it's not significant, but it's moving up. Second, in the middle bar, cybersecurity incidents involving third parties is difficult to manage. 65% agree, so there's a lot of agreement here. And then finally, managing the outsource relationships is a priority. And this is actually an interesting result because you would think that that would be much higher, but it's only 44% this year, a very small increase from last year. Any comments on this slide, Lee?
No.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. So now we're going to change gears just a little bit, and we're going to look at strategic shortfalls in third-party risk management governance. Next slide, good. There's a lot going on here, folks. I apologize. This is really cryptic. There's like a ton of data, but we'll need to talk about it because it's really important to the research. Number one, what scale are we using? We're using a 10-point scale from 1, not effective, to 10, highly effective. So it's an effectiveness scale. And basically, when you use a 1 to 10-point scale, it's common to use kind of a high response, which would be 7, 8, 9, or 10. So if someone basically on a 10-point scale said it was 6 or 5, it wouldn't get calculated. So the percentages show the 7, 8, 9, and 10 response. So effective, highly effective. And so what we're basically looking at is how effective are we, say, at detecting third-party risk? 35% last year, an increase to 42%. And just as a test, you know, the margin of error was 4-point-something%, 5% is statistically significant. Detecting nth-party risk went from 10% to 12%, so we're really not very effective there. Minimizing third-party risk, 23% to 26%. Minimizing nth-party risk, only 12%, both cases, not very high. Mitigating third-party risk was 22%, which is, you know, not high, but higher than 70%, so things are getting worse there. And then mitigating nth-party risk, only at 12%. So again, none of these are remarkable. You know, if you think about what would be highly effective, the 7, 8, 9, 10 response of certainly greater than 50%, that's the threshold when you use a scale like this.
You know, this is interesting, right? There's such a stark difference between the ability to detect and mitigate, or detect versus mitigate. So I'm just curious if you think this is sort of a technology-driven reason that, you know, I think what we've seen a lot of are technologies out there to really detect whether or not there are issues or risks occurring within a system, as opposed to technologies that are more like what you call a traditional vendor risk management type of platform. Perhaps the investments right now are going more into the detection area.
Great question again, Lee, and I think what we find is exactly that. So many tools now that are available because of kind of the rise in huge data breaches and cyber attacks generally. And so it's around the detection. You know, can we identify the bad stuff that occurred, or can we detect quickly? And failure to detect quickly, and other Ponemon studies we show could be incredibly costly. But I don't think we have the same focus. You know, I think, for example, when we look at, you know, mitigating third-party risk, which would be a good thing to do, we don't necessarily have as many technologies available to us, or even investment. You know, we basically see the CISO and the security folks kind of more concerned about detection than they are about mitigating. Although, you know, that's probably an overstatement. I'm sure there are many CISOs that really do care about mitigating, but it's kind of at a different level.
Yeah. And it's this nth party, which just, you know, across the board strikes me as quite significant.
Yeah, that's an important point. So, you know, we basically say, well, we know our third parties, but do we know the third parties to the third party? And the answer is, it's really hard to know. I mean, especially if the third party you're dealing with doesn't disclose their or need to disclose their subcontractors. So the ability to minimize, you say, cut the leakage of confidential data, you know, when you're an nth party, boy, that's challenging.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, but it's challenging. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, so this is a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of bars and colors and such. But who is most accountable for the correct handling of the organization's third-party risk management program? And you'll notice that the number one response is no one person or department is accountable. You could think of that in two ways, right? In other words, it's a shared responsibility, which sounds pretty good, but it could also mean that there's just no one paying attention to it. I shouldn't laugh because that could be the source of a lot of the problems we present in this research. But what is interesting is if you compare the 2016 to 2017 results, that no one person responsible is decreased from 21% to 16%. And my math is correct, that's 5 percentage points, so that's statistically significant. And then the number two response is head of procurement and CISO, chief risk officer, if that role exists, then the CISO, the chief information security officer, then the general counsel or compliance officer, and then the chief security officer, a CSO, head of business continuity management, CTO, and at the bottom of the list, the chief privacy officer. So again, it is kind of interesting, and the fact procurement is number two, I think, is interesting as well, Lee. Any comments on this slide?
Yeah, I mean, but you know, the other thing is if you combine the CISO and the CIO, you know, those two represent probably what would be the largest on here. And so, you know, what I found quite interesting is when you're evaluating the risks of a third party, there's so many, you know, risk domains you need to look at, ranging from financial and regulatory. You've got the typical sort of vendor management process, compliance, contract risk. And so if you couple now this idea of third-party cyber risk, it just strikes me that, you know, it's really difficult to get one single owner of all risk domains. And so I just have to imagine that this idea of collaboration is really kind of a key need. And then even this unifying language, right? The ability to convert, you know, threat intelligence and cybersecurity risks over into what someone might view as a typical control framework. So I think the point only being that it's amazing that this cuts across so many functions, but you know, I would have to imagine, given the risk domains, collaboration is probably key.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't think you get very far if you basically are fragmented or operate in the world of turf and silos. So, you know, you have to figure out a way of getting alignment and participation by a lot of parties. Let's go to our next slide, please. So now, guess what? Our first polling question. I'll turn it over to you, Sharon.
Sure. At this time, we'd like you to answer the following question. You can just the response. Does your company have an inventory of all third parties with whom it shares sensitive and confidential information? And yes, no, or unsure. And we'll just give everyone another minute. Luckily, it's only a quick answer.
Good question.
Okay, just a few more seconds. I'm going to close the poll, and I'm going to show everyone our answers.
Cool, okay. I think there's an error. Come on, audience. Vote.
Oh. Okay, so I've closed the poll. I don't know if you guys are seeing the answers. I'm seeing them from the audience perspective. 66% said yes, that they do have sensitive, and they do have an inventory of all their third parties that share sensitive and confidential information, and that's great. 22% said no, and 13% said they're unsure.
Wow, that's great. Good response. And by the way, when I said what we're seeing as a presenter is everything with zeros. So that's why I was saying, come on, vote. So thank you for voting. Okay, let's go to our next slide. Okay, hey, guess what? Our board of directors requires assurances that third-party risk is being assessed, managed, and monitored. This is very important because if you get the board of directors to have some involvement in the risk management process generally, then that normally leads to a more effective risk management process. And we see that along a lot of different risk domains. But again, we're using that agreement scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And you'll notice the pattern hasn't changed much. The unsure response is very high. It was 30% last year, it's 28% this year. And the strongly agree and agree response together is about the same as the disagree and strongly disagree. So it looks like about half of the respondents that we're doing something in this space. We're getting our boards more involved, and then the other half, probably not, it's not so, at least not as yet. Any comments on that you want to share?
No.
Don't feel obligated.
No, go ahead, Larry.
Go to our next slide. So again, we asked the question, what's the reasons for not regularly reporting third-party risk issues to the board of directors, or just reporting third-party to the board of directors? And now there were 67% in our sample who say their companies do not regularly report to the board on this issue. So of the 33%, the reasons for not regularly reporting, so actually it is of the 67%, the number one response, decisions about third-party risk management programs are not relevant to the board. Again, 51% back in 2016 to 45%. That's 6% difference, and that is statistically significant. Number two, it's not a priority for the board, 45% last year, 38% this year. And then finally, we only provide information if a security incident or a data breach has occurred involving a third party, 39% to 34%. Unsure is 11% down to 9%. You notice the blue bar, and I think this is what's interesting. It's not that there are remarkable results individually, but in general, the blue bar is lower than the red bar. So basically, things are moving in the right direction. And so I read it anyway.
You know, it's interesting, right? Just it's competing priorities often when meeting with the board and what you share. I would think that over time this falls more into like the audit side. But you know, having said that, after today's the results from today's study, I would just gather that you know the combination of the likelihood now of a third-party breach plus the costs associated with those breaches from some of your prior work, that over time that's really going to be material enough that those conversations do become that priority of the board. You know, later on in the presentation, I'm excited we'll be able to share sort of what is the relative impact of those companies who do have more of the board engagement and the likelihood of a breach versus those who do not. And so later on what we'll find is as obvious as I've sort of teed up, there is a pretty significant delta between the two.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Next slide. So again, next topic, lack of visibility into third and nth party relationships. This is really about visibility. Okay, let's go to the polling question. Second polling question. Sharon?
Okay.
All yours.
Our board of directors requires assurances that third-party risk is being assessed, managed, and monitored. Do you agree with that? Do you strongly agree with that statement? Do you agree with that statement? Are you unsure? Do you disagree or strongly disagree? So again, our board of directors requires assurances that third-party risk is being assessed, managed, and monitored. And if you would mind just casting your vote quickly.
Thank you.
We have lots of more material to cover.
For those on the phone, we promise this is the last poll. What we'll do is we'll compare, we'll verbally share and compare the poll versus the survey that we've completed.
And I'm even getting questions coming in that people are agreeing. I don't know if they can vote where they are, but they are agreeing that they strongly disagree. So let's close this poll. I'm going to share the results with the audience, and I'm going to go through. We have 34% say strongly agree. We have 38% say agree. So that's a lot of people that have board of director involvement. 18% are unsure, 8% disagree, and 1% strongly disagree. Okay, That's great.
So,
Okay. Good
so I
response.
think maybe what we'll quickly do is we'll flip back to page 15. So if you look, right, so what we just heard on the call was, I think it was 72% agree or strongly agree, as opposed to the survey that we completed, which is 42%. Yeah. That's amazing, right? So that's a very big difference. I think, hopefully, or maybe one of the reasons is those of you that have joined the call clearly are interested in this topic, and therefore it is of relevance to you and your organization. But that's a very, very big difference.
It could be that the audience is smarter than the average. So
a self-selective audience, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a good thing. Okay, move back. Okay, another really cool result, folks. Does your company have a comprehensive inventory of all third parties with whom it shares sensitive and confidential information? And I think this referred to that first polling question, but the no response is, clearly the overwhelming result, 57% this year versus 60% last year. The yes response is 35% this year versus 33%, and unsure is 8 and 7% respectively. Any comments on this slide, Lee?
Yeah. So the good news is that from the polling question earlier, what we heard was about 66% had visibility into the third parties, which clearly is much larger than 35% here. Again, along the lines of perhaps a self-selective audience. But often one comment I've heard, which we'll see on the next page, is sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, and many of the people that we surveyed just did not have a full inventory because they just didn't have control. And so if you think about applications moving more out to the cloud and functional units often sort of getting responsibility for cloud-based applications, I'm sure many of you face this situation where, just to pick on them, for example, marketing signed up for a cloud provider to support, hosting of information or a webinar or a lead gen process, and it hadn't gone through the same standard sort of corporate onboarding process. I think what we'll see in the next page is often it's really that control over the inventory, which is what drives the visibility.
Cool response. Okay. So these are reasons why companies do not have a comprehensive inventory of all third parties. And again, hopefully this is up to 65% who say their organizations do not have a comprehensive inventory. So the number one response, no centralized control over third-party relationships. Number two response, not a priority issue. Number three, lack of resources to track third parties. Number four, complexity in third-party relationships. And then last and not least, cannot keep track due to frequent turnover in third parties. So obviously the no centralized control is a hands-down response. Lee, any comments on this slide?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not surprising given the comments before, but the general feedback I hear from many of the clients in the market is not that the companies do not have a process in place. It's often that, given that some of the shift to more functional areas of responsibility and cloud-based services, it limits the ability to do it of all, right? Because this question was a comprehensive inventory as opposed to just knowing what you know.
Yeah, exactly. The key word was comprehensive. Okay, now this is an interesting question. We asked the respondents to kind of give us a guesstimate on how many third parties are in their inventory. And this is for the 35% of our respondents who say their organizations have, again, the keyword comprehensive inventory of all third parties with whom it shares sensitive information. And the number one result, as you can see, is 21% more than 1,000. And if you kind of look down the list, you'll notice that it's kind of moving up. In other words, if you look at the difference between the red and bar chart in general, it looks like the number of third parties in the inventory is increasing, which makes sense. It means that these organizations are dealing with more third parties who have third parties or nth parties and so on. Any comments here?
And when we looked at the average, I think we essentially took the average from last year and the average from this year, and even though that may not be representative of every organization on today's call, across the board what we found was approximately a 25% increase. And so just the sheer reliance on third parties and those that they share information with has grown substantially year over year.
Yeah, great. slide. So how does your organization achieve visibility into vendors your company does not have a direct relationship with, the good old nth party? And this is of the only 18% who say their companies know how their information is being accessed or processed by nth parties. Okay, so the number one, reliance on contractual agreements. Number two, reliance upon third parties to notify the organization when the data is shared with an nth party. Number three, response. Now we're getting to small percentages. Monitoring third-party data handling practices with nth parties. Audits and assessments of third-party data handling practices, and the use of specialized or enabling technologies. Okay, number one is the old contract. That's the number one thing that we do. Lee, any comments?
Yeah, after seeing the results from earlier, the fact that only 12% felt they had an effective process for detecting nth parties, and now here we see it's typically being done through contracts and notifications, and I think I'm teeing up the next slide. It just it seems like this really could be one of the biggest risks a company may face. It's, you may have control over your third party, but ultimately they may be then working with their own third party to handle the sensitive information.
Okay, next slide. Do third parties notify your organization when your data is shared with nth parties? And the overwhelming response, no response. 63% said no this year. It was 60% last year. The yes response is 31% this year. And the unsure response is only 6%. So what does this tell you? Is this something that we need to worry about? Okay. Next slide. So this is using that 1 to 10 point scale, folks, and we're looking at the high response, 7, 8, 9, or 10. We are confident a third party would notify us if they had a data breach. And a third party vendor, 35% I believe they would have confidence. So it's a lack of confidence is 1 minus 35% or 65%. And then that was 31% last year. So people are becoming slightly more confident, but the difference between the two is not statistically significant. And then when we look at the same question, but now not third party, we're looking at the nth party vendor. It's only 11% confident. So that's 89% lack confidence or are not confident at all versus 13%. Any comments on this slide, Lee?
No, I'm often curious whether or not regulatory demands often drive some of the notification requirements, and maybe that provides some of the confidence levels.
Yeah, we're starting to see that. I know this new law in New York State for financial service organizations. It's a very important part of the new law is holding your third parties and parties accountable. So I think that would, over time, increase confidence, at least in that sector, financial services. Let's go to our next slide. Now we're talking about the realities of today's third-party risk management programs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so let's go into the next slide. So this is perceptions about vendors, security policies, and procedures. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but we're using that strongly agree to strongly disagree. And we're presenting the agreement, the strongly agree and agree response combined. The statement that we're rating, it is not possible to determine if third-party safeguards and security policies are sufficient to prevent data breach. Again, the response here is over 50%, so it's trending to an agreement, or we believe this to be true, 57% versus 58% last year. The next item here, or attribution, third parties' data safeguards and security policies and procedures are sufficient to respond effectively to a data breach. Now we're below that 50% threshold, so we're trending to either disagreeing or not seeing this as necessarily true. And then the third attribute, third-party management policies and programs are frequently reviewed to ensure they address the ever-changing landscape of third-party risk and regulations. Now we're way below that 50% threshold at 36% this year and 35% last year. Lee, any comments?
Yes. So it looks like not much changed since last year. You think some of this could be tied to the effectiveness statistics from earlier, or perhaps, I think the next slide may show, or a slide in a couple pages will show that most of this feels very that you're protecting via contract versus technology. But what do you think is the driver that not much has changed on the ability to detect a data breach?
You know, I think it's a slow-moving process. I think over a longer timeline, because this is just a 1 year net change, I think we would, I mean, my gut, and I hope that we would see some improvement and that we would see a higher level of agreement for the second and third attribute. So I think some of it is just give it a little bit more time. But also I think that in general, a lot of organizations, as we noted already at some of the questions, do not prioritize. So even though these percentages are low, it hasn't risen to the level of concerns that would result in significant changes to these, to how organizations manage policies and procedures and so forth.
Yeah.
Again, that was a little conjecture on my part. So, okay, our organization has determined the acceptable level of security risk from third parties. This is a strongly agree to strongly disagree scale. And again, we get an interesting result. The middle, the unsure response, is very high. It was 27% last year. It is now 23%, still very high. But the strongly agree and agree, if you add those up together, we're getting to the threshold, near the threshold, but not quite there yet. So it's again distributed where the disagree and strongly disagree is less than the agree and strongly agree. So things here are kind of moving more to agreement. Okay, next slide. Third-party risk levels are rarely updated, and let's look at the scale below. It's never updated as needed, updated every 6 months, annually, every 2 years, and unsure. And again, the number one response, it's updated on an as-needed basis. And then the second highest response is never updated at all. I think that worries me the most, the never, not as needed. But Lee, any comments on this?
No, I think that to me was sort of the big aha for me, because, look, I think the fact of the matter is you'll never really eliminate all risk from an organization. So just putting in place a set of policies that can be updated periodically just to measure the types of risks of a project. Perhaps the project's levels have changed. Perhaps your adoption of certain technologies has changed. And so, it would strike me that typically you might want to find a process in play, a process that's periodic. I don't think you'll be able to do it ongoing, but maybe it's every 6 months, every annual. But this never is what's most striking to me.
I agree completely. So now, these are steps taken to evaluate third parties, and it's of the 40% who do perform evaluations, so 60% do not. More than one response is permitted, so it basically means that if you add up all of these percentages for the blue and the red, it's going to be greater than 100%. So a lot of stuff here. Acquire a signature on contracts that legally obligate third parties to adhere to security and privacy practices. That's number one. Obtain references from other organizations that engage the third party. Number three, review written policies and procedures that may be available. Number four, obtain evidence of a security certification, such as ISO, or even compliance with NIST standards and so forth. Obtain indemnification, that's a hard word for me, I'm sorry, from the third party in the event of a data breach. Conduct an audit of the third party security and privacy practices. Now we're getting into kind of low territory. Obtain a self-assessment conducted by a third party, other, and then unsure. So really the overwhelming response is acquire signatures on contract. Contracts are still very important to this risk management process. And then number two, of course, obtain references from organizations that you can rely upon that basically engage the third party. I think those are your top two choices. Lee, any comments?
No.
Okay. So we have to ask the question of the 60% who don't perform evaluations, why not? What are your reasons? Well, the number one reason, which I think is a pretty honest response, we don't have the internal resources to check or verify. I think that's true for lots of companies. You're basically running with your head down. If you don't see the problem, you don't have the problem. Number two, the data shared with the third party is not considered sensitive or confidential. Number three, the third party is subject to data protection regulations that are not intended to protect our information. Number 4, the third party is subject to contractual terms. Number 5, we rely on the business reputation, and so on and so forth. So you can read the percentages as we get into lower numbers. So again, it's about resources to check and verify.
Curious, the resources question, right? Because you hear that come up often, and even outside of just sort of data privacy risks, but you may say broader regulatory compliance risks as well. Do you believe that this? If I go back to earlier, we talked a little bit about the board and executive team, while getting more involved, still not completely involved. Do you think there's some tie between a board and executive team involvement and the ability for somebody to say, I have enough resources, essentially either to make the case or because there's ownership at the highest level, the resources are then sort of properly allocated and budgeted?
A great question, Lee. And in my experience, it's really absolutely critical to get C-level involvement. If you have an owner like the CIO or even the general counsel, but a C-level that has the clout in the organization, when they're involved, and they basically will drive investment. If you don't have a C-level, say it's a middle management, more of a tactical thing, sometimes you just have the problem. It doesn't rate as important as other things, and so you don't necessarily get the money to do things right. You know how to do it right, you just don't have the resources. So I think that is absolutely critical. And I see this in a lot of Ponemon studies we've been doing for more than a decade. We see that C-level support as being absolutely critical if you're going to have a strong security posture. Okay, next slide. Third-party monitoring procedures used to ensure the adequacy of security and privacy practices. And this is of 44% of respondents who say their companies do not monitor the security and privacy practices of vendors. And so more than one response is permitted. Legal and procurement review at 67% this year. Internal audit drops all the way down to 34%. Control self-assessment. An independent auditor verification by a third party. An annual self-certification. Random tests or spot checks. Automated monitoring tools. That's fairly low. It's only 19% other and unsure. So any surprises on this list to you, Lee?
Yeah, I think the important thing is that you'll find that it's somebody's posture, somebody's likelihood or risk to you changes over time. Day one, we saw that many companies are not doing an evaluation up front, and if they are, it's done through legal and contract. But then beyond that, as we move into monitoring, I'm often less concerned about day one and more concerned about day 50. So what was surprising is that there's such a strong percentage of those that use legal and procurement review as opposed to just at least tech monitoring via some of the technologies out there that can help monitor vendors and third parties.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think we rely on, again, that legal and that mindset that if we have a contract, that solves 80% of the problem. And it may in some cases, but not in every case. Okay, let's go to our next slide. Does your company require third parties to indemnify or ensure compliance with your security and privacy practices? And I think the key word is the word that I have difficulty saying, indemnification. No response is the overwhelming response at 59%. It was 56% last year. Yes response is 36% and 35% respectively, and unsure is only 5% this year. Any comments?
No, I think I was very surprised actually by this because, earlier on we mentioned that the contracting process is typically the way to protect and manage the risks, yet the provisions, at least in this question, really do have room for tightening.
Yeah, agreed. Next slide. Okay, this is a great slide. So remember we talked about the 8 third-party risk management practices, and this is showing the likelihood of a data breach. You know what I'll do, Lee, if you don't mind, I'll set it up so I'll explain how these numbers work because it's a little complicated. And then if you could provide, from the executive perspective, what it means, why it's important. But the blue bar is the likelihood of a breach when the governance practice that's presented, one of the 8, is not deployed. And the red is the likelihood of a data breach when the governance practice is not deployed. And so basically, one of the questions you might remember, the mean likelihood of a data breach for the sample is 56%. Okay? So if you basically had the governance practice, again, these are crosstabs, that likelihood of a data breach goes from 56% down to 46%. Okay, that's good news, right? Because there are fewer data breaches. And if you basically are not implementing that governance practice, it goes up to 66%. So basically, it's 10 points. In the first case, it's 10 points above the mean or below the mean. And then in the second case, it's 10 points above the mean. And the difference between the two, the gap, if you will, is 20 percentage points. So now keep in mind that this is not additive. You can't basically do this for each one of these because there's a high correlation between each of these practices. Companies do these practices collectively. You know, they're not just doing one at a time. But keep in mind that that gap, that crosstab, shows just how important these practices are. Lee, I know you have some comments you'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, these are the part of the studies and research that I find most interesting because it's great to share that there's lots of risks and breaches are going up, and I think we see that and hear that in the news, and now this survey validates that. But what really to me is interesting is the ability to correlate certain factors or best practices just to reduce the likelihood, right? So at least you come away with, here are the things I should be thinking about. If you go back to the results of the survey, I think, if I recall, it was about 66% said they had an inventory of their third parties, and it might have been 72, or it was around the 70% had board assurance. So this is great news, because if you interpret the graph on the page, essentially by having an inventory of your third parties, if you look at the second box, it would reduce your likelihood of a breach by 10% from the average. The other way to look at it is if you had it versus if you did not have it, it was a 20% swing. So, the fact of the matter is, again, this may have been a self-selective call, but those on the phone really, you put in place the number one or number two best practice for reducing the likelihood of a breach. The board assurance comment, so if you look at the bottom chart, we had about 72% had board assurance, and that would reduce the likelihood of a breach by 5% from the average, or 10% compared to those who did not do it. So, to me, one of the most important items I heard was this idea of just knowing who your third parties are. I see and live it every day, and I know how difficult it's becoming with this idea of a decentralized control and multiple systems. But as you can see, it really is the biggest, or one of the biggest risk factors or ways to reduce the risk. And I think that feeds through everything else, right? So start by knowing who they are, and then you can think about the risk policies and practices to figure out what risks do they pose. And from there, you could build a set of controls to measure against it. It does lead me to an earlier point I mentioned around the nth party. So realistically, this seems like one of the most difficult points to solve. So this idea of notification and contractual provisions really can provide a pretty significant lift, and that you should at least be putting in place in all of your contracts as you work through them. But hopefully these are they're significant, they're substantial breach reduction best practices driven off of the data, and the good news is for those of you on the call, many of you already have at least two of these in place.
Very cool, thank you. Next slide. Okay, this is, I'm going to go through this because I know we're running out of time for Q&A, so I'll move through this pretty quickly. Let's go to our next slide. So the folks that participated range from senior executive down to staff level and contractors. And the largest group is that orangey color, and that's staff and analysts. Let's go to our next slide. In terms of the primary person you or your leader report to in the organization, it was pretty varied here, from the CISO and CSO, compliance officer, CIO, and so on. By the way, all of these stats are provided in a research report, so you don't have to take copious notes. We'd love for you to kind of look at the report as a whole. We'll tell you how to get a copy in a couple of seconds. Let's go to our next slide. This is the good and bad news. The good news is we cover a whole bunch of industry segments. The bad news is we cover a whole bunch. And what I mean by that is some of the slices to this pie are just so thin that we don't have enough, even with a good sample size, to be able to come up with an industry cut for that industry. But we basically do for financial services, and healthcare. Those are kind of the big three. Let's go to our next slide. And in terms of headcount, ranged from less than 500 people, full-time equivalent employees, to well more than 75,000. I think the largest company that participated had, hundreds of thousands of employees globally. So we had, SMB, mostly on the middle of that scale, to some very, very large companies. So our next slide. Caveats, we do surveys. We love surveys, and they're great, but there are inherent biases that you need to be aware of before you form your conclusions. The big three would be non-response bias, which means the people who do the survey are not the same as people who decided not to participate. We test for it, but it could be an issue. And then the sampling frame bias, and then finally self-reported results. And that's important because the person taking the survey and a bad day the same person might respond in a very different way than those people that had a good day. So just keep in mind that these biases exist, and we try to mitigate and deal with those issues head on, but they may always present themselves. So we accept that as researchers. It's never perfect. Next slide. And look at that. Thank you for joining us, but we also have some information about the report, and I think we want to do a little bit of Q&A now. I think we have about 8 minutes to do that.
Absolutely. So let me just interrupt here for a second. Again, if you want to download the report, we will send this link out in an email after the event, but if you want to go to www.opus.com/Ponemon, you can download it now. But I do want to get to some of our questions that came in. So our first question is teeing us up for the next 2018 report, I believe. Are there any statistics that measure organizations' investment in third-party management, whether it be staff, technology, etc., with the effectiveness of the function? In other words, how much time and money should we be spending on this?
Yeah, good question, and I'll tackle this one, but I would love to hear Lee's response as well. But basically, we've done a fair amount of benchmarking to try to find out, what's the right mix? How much should organizations spend on, third-party risk management and many other aspects of a security process and practices. And it does differ by industry, by organizational size, and a whole bunch of variables. But if anyone is interested in seeing some of our benchmark data, we'd be pleased to share that with you, on a pro bono basis, as a professional courtesy. But there's no formula for it, and this is true across the board. So a lot of companies might say, X amount of dollars is sufficient. A company that's very similar might actually reach a conclusion that it's not sufficient. And we do see that kind of variance across the board. There isn't necessarily a mechanical way of determining the right spend.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a great question for 2018, as you mentioned. I think, there's the typical size, industry, risk tolerance, number of third parties, but ultimately what we've seen or heard a lot in general from the market has been very much around this idea of manually doing it versus automating a process, and then the types and level of risk a company is willing to accept. But I think that's great benchmarking data that Larry mentioned he has.
Okay, let's take our next question. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to slide 13 if we can. Slide 13 showed us a low involvement by the Chief Privacy Officer. Why are they not more involved in this process? And I believe it was very low, like 1 or 2%. Sorry for the big scroll back.
So this is Larry again, and my gut feel tells me that CPOs are underrated, and we love CPOs. We've been very active in establishing the privacy community and the IAP and so on. But I think in general, it's not viewed as just a privacy thing. This is broader than privacy. So I think that's why the the percentages are so low. Another possibility too is a lot of organizations may have a CPO that wears many hats and might be like an associate or the general counsel. They might be in the legal or compliance office. So it could be that in some cases, even though CPO is low, if you factor those other people that wear multiple hats, the number would be a lot higher in percentage terms. Good question. How are we doing, Sharon? Any other questions?
Oh, sorry about that. I should have asked this first. Can you define a third party?
Good question. I'm going to have Lee do that.
Yeah, so I've actually, I'd say I've heard it defined as many different ways. Typically, I think of it as a vendor, a contractor, a business associate, a distributor. So anybody that you may be relying on that's external to your organization that you are leveraging for business purposes. I've heard it defined in multiple ways, especially when you think about bribery and corruption, often viewed more as business associates or those who will be representing you in market. But for the purposes of this, and I think there's actually some really good definitions in some of the financial regulations, that we define it, or we've thought of it as a vendor, a contractor, a sub, or a distributor, or somebody that you might be relying externally within your organization to do business practices or services.
I agree with that. Ditto.
Okay. Here's one. We probably only have time for one or maybe two. Getting a hold of your fourth parties seems impossible. What advice do you have?
Lee, would you mind tackling that, and I could be number two?
Yeah, I would start by saying, as we saw earlier, first and foremost, at least put a contractual provision in place that requires notification. And for those of you that have seen an organization, I've often seen that that term in place, but never really enforced. By that I mean, if your information is being handed over not only through a vendor but to an nth party, someone may notify him and say, I've got a subcontractor or a contractor working on my behalf, and it just goes nowhere. So I think ultimately this idea of managing the fourth party once notified the same way that you would be managing your third party is the right approach. There are technology tools out there that may just ask the question via a questionnaire, and then that becomes part of an aggregated list. But ultimately, I think a lot of that burden in the very near term is often put in place in terms of notifications and contractual provisions. I would say, though, when notified, if your company has a third-party program in place that you feel confident in terms of monitoring and managing, when notified that your information is being at least accessed by somebody with that information, even though it may be considered an nth party, my strong recommendation, and what I've seen many clients often do, is put that back into the same program that you have as a third party, that just make it a relationship. So ultimately it's a branch or connected off of the person you're managing, but at least that way it becomes part of a standard program.
Okay, one more question, because there are a lot, and I'm sorry we're not going to get to all of them, but we will answer them after the event via email. You mentioned the use of technology tools for monitoring third parties' security practices. Any suggestions?
This sounded like a commercial, right, for Opus and the Hyperos third-party management system. So, ultimately, right, so that would be one suggestion from my perspective. But the reason being that there are some platforms or tools out there that really help you holistically manage the risks associated with third parties, and essentially come up with a level of risk that you as a firm are willing to take and accept, and then measure each of your third parties and their controls against those risks. Having said that, it's not all about the platform or the tool. There are many technologies out there that also monitor from a cybersecurity perspective. You'll hear of Security Scorecard, BitSight, and Risk Recon as three of the key technologies out there that ultimately will manage those third-party cyber risks externally, and then feed back into technology systems that will then help you start to view the risks holistically. But any further questions, or if you'd like to learn more about Opus and the Hyperos platform, when we show the URL, you can access it right there, or clearly you can reach out to me.
Okay, well, we're going to have to wrap up today. We are 1 minute over time. So again, this concludes our webinar for today, and I want to thank both our speakers for doing an excellent job today. If you have submitted a question that we did not address, we will forward all your questions to the appropriate speaker and get them answered. If you have additional questions, please always feel free to reach out using our website, www.opus.com, and send questions through the Contact Us form on the website. The slides, the recorded webcast, will be uploaded onto our website at the beginning of next week and available for replay, so you'll all get the slides at the end of this event. Within the hour, please look for an email with the web address to the Ponemon report, plus a link to a survey where you can provide your feedback for this webinar, as well as future topics for discussion. We appreciate your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.